My name's Noah Prates, former election official, 20 years, retired before all the crazy stuff that you guys are dealing with now. I'm the president and co-founder of the Elections Group. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, the Elections Group partners with state, local, federal officials to implement new programs, improve processes. We provide guidance, resource, subject matter expertise, direct management support for local jurisdictions. Our team comes from across the spectrum, all former election officials and election experts in the United States. Growing up, my name is Noah, right? So growing up, I had a poster on the wall of my home and it read, "Plan ahead. It wasn't raining when Noah built the ark." I think of that often in the election administration context. There's no question, as you know, the United States Department of Homeland Security and CISA admonishes us that we're in the most complex threat environment ever for election officials. So it requires a lot of planning. Now, I'm also a member of the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, a cross-partisan group of election administrators, law enforcement working to support policies and practices that protect both election workers and voters from violence and threats. And we work to build relationships across the community of election officials and law enforcement. Fundamental to all of our understanding of risk is to understand the environment more fully. You know, if we see and feel storm clouds building around us, it's important to hear from experts the variety of shapes and directions those storms may come from. I know I made assumptions, but after hearing Professor Pape previously, some of those were very wrong. That's why we're excited to be able to bring him here to this audience to go through things. So we have two panelists today. I'm going to turn to him briefly to say hello. First is Robert Pape, a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats, kind of a hero in a lot of ways. I get to be a guest lecturer at the University of Chicago. Got my Maroons t-shirt on today. Then Jasleen Singh, Democracy Council at the Brennan Center, will say hello. And then pivot right back to Professor Pape, who's going to deliver a 30-minute presentation to us, which is fantastic. Jasleen will deliver hers. We'll do some questions afterwards, and we will call it a Friday. So first, a quick hello from Dr. Pape, and then Jasleen.
Hello, everybody who's watching. Thank you, Noah. Great to meet you, Jasleen. And I am delighted to be here. I'm delighted to help.
And hi, everyone. Good to meet you as well, Professor Pape. I'm Jasleen Singh. I'm with the Brennan Center for Justice, and I'm going to be walking us through guardrails against voter intimidation after Professor Pape's presentation today.
All right. Well, I think it's to you, Dr. Pape.
I want to say a big thank you to the Elections Group, to the Brennan Center, to Jasleen for joining us today. We are heading into not just the most consequential election in our lifetimes, but what is now the most dangerous election in our lifetimes. The second Trump assassination attempt, I don't think I have to put much more of a point on that. This is not something that we have really any recent historical experience with multiple assassination attempts against a former president, a leading presidential candidate, much less, that you have to go back to the 70s, less in the run-up to the presidential election. And this is just an indicator of how important this is. And it's also, I would just want to say, how I have just a tremendous amount of respect for our election workers, our election officials, because in many ways you really are right on the front lines. And this is just such an important time, and our country owes you just a tremendous amount of gratitude for your service. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now shift over to my presentation. Just give me a moment here to do the usual setting up. So just 1 second, please. And now I'm trying to also see if we can shift over to presentation mode. There we are. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about our research at the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats that's related to political violence in the upcoming election. And I'm essentially going to assess for you the threat from both the right and the left, give you a full spectrum understanding of that landscape that Noah laid out. I am a scholar of political violence, and I've been studying political violence for 30 years. Lots of publications. You'll be able to go to my Wikipedia page and find those. You'll see much of the work, especially in the last 20 years, has been focused on international terrorism. That actually changed significantly about 4 years ago when I started to focus on the most dangerous problem for our country and I would say the least understood, which is American political violence, which we've seen a surge of in recent years. I've conducted over a dozen national surveys that are at the gold standard to understand support for political violence in the United States. I've done detailed analysis of every single person who's been arrested for J6 with large research teams at the University of Chicago and much, much more to get understanding. Now, I also am a scholar who, in my career, has done a fair bit of advising. This is not paid consulting. This is actually advising. And I have advised all four White Houses since 2001. And that includes the Trump and the Biden administration. And if you look at the bottom, also other folks across the political spectrum in the United States and also internationally. You'll see the Chancellery of Germany, you'll see the Prime Minister of New Zealand, et cetera, et cetera. And it's because a lot of the work that I do and have been doing for decades is not just information to be published and put on a shelf, but is often valuable for decision makers in time for them to understand what's right in front of them. Now, today, we're going to talk about surveys on public attitudes and trends related to political violence. And then we're going to focus also on some effective messaging strategies should political violence happen in November. This will be an important issue for election officials. Also, some predictions and key issues to watch for, especially in November. And then we'll talk even more specifically in that regard. Now, why is America at this precarious moment for our democracy? You see, our research shows that January 6th was a symptom of a larger issue facing our country. The United States is seeing historical rise in political violence in the last several years, and this is related to the fact that the United States is going through a historical demographic transition from a white majority democracy to a white minority, truly multiracial democracy. And this is leading to contentious politics in our country. Essentially, this is leading to a group on the right that wants to slow down, possibly even reverse that transition to a multiracial democracy, and a group on the left that wants to continue, possibly even accelerate that transition. And that is what's underneath the rise of Donald Trump, the reaction by the left, and this era that I call the era of violent populism on the right and the left, which goes on both sides. And you can just see from now, those listening should also know that Foreign Affairs, this major prestigious journal, is about to publish a big piece by me on the rise of the era of violence. And that's going to happen next week. That is in the last week of September. And so whenever anybody watches this, they'll also be able to go to this 5,000 word foreign affairs piece to get a much broader understanding than even we can do here. Now, the danger here is rooted not in a particular militia group, and it's not rooted in a particular foreign actor. The danger is that there are millions of Americans willing to support violence to achieve political goals. That's what violent populism means. This, I would say, is the greatest danger to American democracy, and it's going to be a danger as we move into the 2024 election. I've been warning about assassination attempts actually since last June, and so I am not surprised that we have had assassination attempts against Donald Trump. I'm glad we have not had more, and I'm glad I've not had them against senior Democratic leaders in recent months, although remember, there was the Pelosi attempt. And so this is something, though, that we have to be very concerned about with the election, but it's likely to be a problem during America's entire transition to a multiracial democracy, which will take until about 2035, according to Census Bureau trends. And that's why I say the November 2024 election will be the most consequential and the most dangerous in our lifetimes. Now, why is public support the key to political violence? Because you're going to see, I'm going to track public support for political violence. It's because the more there's mass community support for political violence, the much more likely political violence is, and the more dangerous it is. And there are a variety of reasons for this, and you can see them on the screen. The most important is that it's not so much that everybody in this pool is going to act violently, it's that this is what creates the mantle of legitimacy for those volatile actors to act out and nudge them to political violence. Now, where are we on the spectrum of political violence? You hear many folks talk about civil war. In fact, there's movies about this. I think this is just too far and it distracts us from the actual middle of the escalation trajectory, which are what we have to worry about, what we have been dealing with, and what we should be dealing and what we have to deal with going forward. And these are violent protests and small group lethal violence. And you'll just see there's a lot of them. And we can add at the bottom now the second Trump assassination attempt that just happened a few days ago, last weekend. Now, I also, though, want to call attention to what do I mean about how support for political violence works. You see, the more there's support for political violence among ordinary Americans, the more this nudges volatile individuals who might have their own psychosocial mental health issues, absolutely for sure, but the more it pushes those volatile individuals to believe that violence they do will be popular. And that's why, with, say, the first Trump shooter, the first assassination shooter in July, the most important thing we know about him is he thought this would be his premiere. He would become popular. And now what we know with the second shooter, the most important thing is not, can we really drill into, are they Republican and Democrat? No, we often see with these volatile individuals, they are what's called movement hoppers. And what they do is gravitate to violence they believe will be popular. So really, the taproot of this that we can actually get a handle on, scientifically measure, is public support for political violence. That is what is the big part of the landscape that really matters, and that's what makes actual political violence more likely and more dangerous. Now, we're going to look at our tracking survey. We do these surveys every few months. We want to do a new one in November for obvious reasons. And what we do at the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats, we have done over a dozen of these high quality national surveys focusing not on a horse race of who's going to win an election, but on support for political violence in the United States across the spectrum. And notice we have narrow margins of error. Which is excellent. And we also work with NORC at the University of Chicago, the most respected academic polling planet. Think of them as the Gallup among university polling agencies. Now, the first finding you're going to see is that there's actually more public support for violence against Trump than to restore Trump to the presidency. You see, we asked the question here, and I'm showing you as we asked the questions here in June. So I definitely realize Kamala Harris has come in, but I'm showing you this as we actually did it. We asked the question, do you believe, do you agree that the use of force is justified to restore Donald Trump to the presidency? Well, you see 6.9% of the population agree with that. That equates to 18 million American adults. And then we asked also the question, the use of force justified to prevent Trump from becoming president. And notice 10% of the public agrees there. That equates to 26 million. Well, let's look at then the spectrum of their answers. And you can see that the red, those are the equivalent of the 26 million who agree. But notice the large ambivalent who aren't so sure. That's a large number. And so we have to be worried as we move forward. These numbers can change, and we want them to shrink, but they could also grow, and it would be the ambivalent who would most likely move. Now, we also can ask lots of other questions, and we do in our survey, and you can see, and these are questions right from the survey. We're not importing them from elsewhere. And you can see that a third of this group already own guns. And notice the Trump shooters have no problem getting guns. They own them, or effectively so. And notice they already believe that when the police are violently attacked, they deserve it. They have very negative attitudes toward the police. And notice a large number of them have attended a protest or other rally in the last 12 months. So this is a very active and potentially dangerous group. They're very comfortable, in other words, with activity and violence. And then we went a little deeper. Actually, after the Trump assassination attempt, we really wanted to drill into, we've done this before, but we just wanted to redo it. What do people mean when they think of the use of force? So we did a rapid study to find out, and the answers are disconcerting because we discovered in July, and this was after the first Trump assassination attempt, that 55% of the respondents, when we gave them text boxes, tell us what you mean when you support the use of force to prevent Trump from being president. 55% mean deadly, lethal force. 36% mean killing Trump, assassinating Trump. They say so. 23% mean mass violent protests, January 6th style, except by Democrats. And then 8% actually talk about coups, military coups, overthrowing the Trump government, where it's the Democrats doing the coups. Now, of course, others also think of more either nonviolent or things in reaction. So we're showing you the full range of answers, but effectively that's 14 million. Here. So yes, it's not, we can ask this in more pointed terms, but this is a very, very tinderbox of a situation that we're in. And also you can see that the numbers, giving you some of the text boxes, these are actually they say. And when I say they mean assassination of Trump, they say, I mean something like, I justify the attempted assassination of Trump. I'm imagining the assassination of Trump, murder at his rally. I thought of attempts at killing him. The mass protests, I imagine similar to January 6th. We ran January 6th right back at him, if you see what I mean. So we know what this means, and this tells us what a tinderbox of a country we really are in. Now, we can also look at this on the right, of course. And you can see on the right that those 18 million who believe that force is justified to restore Trump to the presidency, a large number, but so too are there ambivalent there. There's numbers that could move into that column. And this is particularly worrisome as we move into October, as we get closer. Now we have 2 Trump assassination attempts. So we have to worry not just about more Trump assassination attempts, we have to worry about retaliatory attacks by radical Trump supporters. And then we have to worry about possible spirals of these. So this is something I've been warning about since early summer. This is something we're seeing in the data. And this data really is the best canary in the coal mine, not just snapshot in time, but what to expect sort of in the near term, or what to worry about as potential, the way I think about it. Now, we can ask the very same questions about guns, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see that this number too, almost half own guns. We asked some questions where the wording was, do you agree the people who stormed the Capitol, we use that term, were patriots? And you can see over a third agree with that. A militia member here starts to creep up, militia member or no one. So this too is a worrisome picture of that 18 million. Now, we can also look over time, and you can see, and we'll be tracking these trajectories over time as well in the future. You can see how violent support for Trump has gone up, especially with the first federal indictment. So the first federal indictment was actually the first inflection point here, changing an almost 2-year decline in violent support for Trump, and then that reversed. And this is something that is really important to see and is not captured by the latest public opinion polls and most of the newspapers focusing on favorability and focusing on voting. We just aren't focused on that issue. That's David Axelrod at the University of Chicago, one of the world's experts at this. He does that. And then so he's also very interested often in our surveys. Now, I also want to show you how this connects with that shift to a multiracial democracy that I was talking about. And you'll see that that radical support on both sides reflects some of the concerns I mentioned earlier in my talk. So we ask people, do you agree, disagree that the Democratic Party is trying to replace the current electorate with new people, more obedient voters from the third world? In other words, we're asking people about, do they think the Democratic Party is involved in what's called the Great Replacement, you may have heard of. And what you see is the more people agree with that statement, notice it's 6 times more likely they're going to support the use of force to restore Trump to the presidency. We don't have a perfect parallel with this on the left, but we have something close, which is, do you agree, disagree? America is systemically racist against non-white people and always has been. And notice that the more you agree with this, nearly twice as likely to agree and support the use of force. So this is that other side wanting to continue that shift, and it is a very high priority. We also found very important characteristics about where they live, the supporters of violence on both sides, and also what their education is, and also what their age is. And the big finding here is that these are very much in the mainstream. These are not in the fringe, very far away. This is a picture here that is, I'm not trying to comfort you, I'm not trying to make it distressful, but this is really much more of what you will see is ordinary Americans fitting this bill. And let me just show you what I mean. First, where do the 18 million who support force for Trump live? 81% live in metro or suburban areas. That is urban suburbia. 20% do live in rural areas, but this is not simply a picture of white rural rage. This would be a mistake. There is, to be sure, some of that, but the biggest thing that's happening here, you could take all the rural away and you would still have a large fraction of folks who fit this bill in urban and suburban areas. And what about prevent? Well, this is also an urban suburban phenomenon mainly. Again, not that there's not anything in rural, but this is really happening too where the largest concentrations of the United States are, and also where the demographic change is right on the front lines, which is in our urban and suburban areas. Now, what about if we look at college education? What you see is that nearly 40%, 39% of those who support force for Trump have at least some college education. And so this is not simply a product of having no college experience whatsoever. And on those who support force against Trump, we see a very similar picture, a little different numbers, but very similar picture of 39% with at least some college. What about age? What you can see is that this is very much 58% of those who support Force for Trump are 30 to 59 years old. That is, this is not simply concentrated super heavily among 18 to 24-year-olds. You might think that's where it would be. No, this is actually a lot of folks in the middle of their lives are some of the biggest supporters of political violence. And that's true also on force against Trump. Now, what are the implications? The implications of this, especially for election officials and election workers, is that there's a critical need for law enforcement to prepare for the potential of political violence after the November election. This means we already have to have some knowledge about what would be useful messaging strategies if those violent events happen after November 5th. We have to, it's important to talk about some specific scenarios, and then it's absolutely crucial that we do updated national surveys here in November, right after the election, to provide as most up-to-date information that we can. And the violence, we don't know which way it can come here after the election, so we have to cover both sides of the spectrum. Now, CPOST has done some extensive messaging research, research on messaging strategies, and so I just want to share with you this research. The key thing to know is that 75% of Americans abhor political violence. And we should lean into that 75%. And that's the key to building messaging. It's to lean into that 75%. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that 75%, nearly 75% support more calls and more bipartisan calls condemning any political violence in the United States. And that's true of the vast majority of Republicans and the vast majority of Democrats. So this is a really important finding to lean into. And it's also important to see that what the message should do is not so much try to stop anger as redirect it away from violence and toward voting, toward political solutions. So if your party lost this time, you just get ready. There'll be another election in 2026. It's every 2 years in this country we have significant national elections. We can use those rhythms to our advantage, even in the near term, right after one election. The next one is never really that far away. So we need to lean into that after November 5th. Now, the key, as I said then, is not suppressing the anger, but redirecting it. And we've done an analysis about the exact wording of messages. We did this with a large survey experiment, essentially it's called in my field. We tested 6 messages plus no message whatsoever. We took some of them right out of some actual leaders' messages. And we did find that there is a best message, and I'm not trying to be partisan here at all. I'm just telling you that there was a best message that we found. The others don't do quite as well. Some almost do as well, but some do especially worse here, because when you condemn the party most associated with that act of violence, you get the backs of everybody up. That's asymmetry here is not a solution to this problem, although that's often a go-to, because it's easy for a Democratic leader to Republicans, or easy for Republicans to criticize Democrats. We've got to calm everybody down and say all violence, wherever it comes from, is illegal, anti-American. We've got to discourage it as immoral. Because after one event, you can have copycat events, you can have retaliatory events, you can have multiple ways in which one event can trigger more. So it's all violence we need to tamp down. And this just shows you what a data slide looks like from our messaging study here. So you can see why we've looked at it across different Democrat, Independent, Republican, and we've tested this out. And that's what that data slide looks like. And the green, of course, is the message that does the best. And that green is this language here. So this is exactly the language that we found works the best. And you'll see that it is condemning violence on all sides, wherever it happens. And it's really a quite simple message, but it needs to be issued. It needs to be issued multiple times. This would be by the leader, by the president, by presidential candidates, by their surrogates. This would be by the governors of states. This would be by mayors. Everybody should be giving the same message here if we find such an event after November 5th. Now, what are the post-election risks? I just want to stress that we are in radical uncertainty. We have dark clouds now. We now know that we do have patterns of violence, that it is occurring. It's not a campaign in the sense there's no organization running this violence, but it is exactly in line with what I showed you as the logic of political violence that I showed you at the beginning of the talk. But even though we can't really have a crystal ball to anticipate every single scenario, there are just way too many possibilities. The way to manage radical uncertainty is just to be aware of the structure of what's at issue after the November 5th election. You probably already know this, but it will be again the count. Although this year, I think the potential for violence is not just January 6th. This is now something that can fast forward, and I'm just giving you here the structure of the election schedule. Of course, this can slide and change and so forth, but it's very important to know that there are a number of key deadlines before we get to January 6th. And these are absolutely crucial to getting to a certification of a president on January 6th, and then the actual installment of the next president on January 20th, 2025. Now, the big thing I though want to call your attention to is the vulnerability, and I mean the physical vulnerability. I don't mean the cyber vulnerability, the physical vulnerability of ballot tabulation centers. There could well be, you see the election now as we speak today, September 20th, the election today, all the polls show this is absolutely neck and neck. We don't know what will happen. We have radical uncertainty, but it could well be that there will be, it'll be a very close election, at least in some states. We don't know which states yet, but we can anticipate it might be. And that means we can anticipate that the count again is going to be extremely consequential. Well, we know that with all the push for election transparency, there's going to be a lot of attention, that is video attention, on ballot tabulation centers that is beyond the precinct level. And we also know those are going to be geolocated, and potential bad volatile actors will know that as well. So this is not something that's going to be, we can hide. We can't hide these buildings. We can't hide the ballot tabulation centers. In fact, they're probably, if they're really important, going to be on TV. You see what I mean? Much like a Trump rally's on TV. And so we need to be concerned about the physical security here of the building, of the workers, and of the ballots. You see, because a potential target here is literally to destroy, in any state where the election count is close, something like 5-7% of the ballots themselves, to literally destroy the ballots, to make it then impossible for there to be further counts that work against the candidate that attacker was trying to support. So this is something that we need to take seriously this year. Let's hope it doesn't happen. Let's hope that it's such an, none of this happens. However, given the volatility we've already experienced, given the support for violence we're already seeing, it is time to take this extremely seriously. And the most crucial step that we should take is we should now already be preparing for a mid-November survey. That is, we should be doing a new national survey based on the CPOS survey that you have just seen here, not just nationally, but in the 7 key swing states. Now, if we field this on November 8 and 10, we can have results by November 18. Now, I realize that's, a few, that's after November 5th, but we can't do this any faster and have actually valuable results. So as much as we might like to know how dangerous things are on November 7 and 8, we really do need to use the social science at the gold standard so that we can actually provide absolutely high quality information. And this would be information to state law enforcement. This would be information to governors. And they are going to need to know that this isn't just a rapid thing that was done overnight where margins of error 10%. We need to know this high quality information. And I hope that we can get support to be able to do this. We would need that support here relatively soon. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. Again, I have nothing but the greatest respect for all that you are doing on the front lines of our democracy.
I'll bring it back. There's some questions in chat. Well, we'll take this one right now for Professor Pape. Well, Jasleen, if you want to start up your slideshow, but the question in the chat is that, multiracial is your framing, but is it fair to assume that it's sort of broader? It's a redistribution of power, including women, LGBTQ,
Oh, of course. Yes, yes. So when I say multiracial, think of this as a much broader understanding. So race is very, very important, but so too is gender, because there's essentially, if you think about it, we have very heavily a nativist side and a multicultural side. And this will become a little clearer in that foreign affairs piece that I have coming out next week. But this is what's occurring. And so these are actually bundles of attitudes, they're bundles of ideas. And it is not as if the nativist side is 100% white. That would be a complete misunderstanding of what's occurring here. There are traditionalist American values that are be supporting on one side. You don't have to be white in order to support them. And there is a multicultural set of values. And so that is what is at stake in these transitions. So it's a broader bundle of values. Does that help?
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. I really take from this, like, the messaging is important. I look at that ambivalent set, and I'm on both sides, and I realize that gives us each individually a lot of agency. We tend to say that's not our problem, it's their problem. It's my team not doing this, their team. And recognize that, wait, my team, whatever team we're on, has got some fundamental issues that can be addressed. And,
And just to build on that for a moment, Noah, so I'm probably not the only one who, after the first Trump assassination attempt, had family members, friends, some of whom snickered and say, oh, I wish the shooter had been more accurate. That is what it means to support political violence. That is what it means to give permission for that. And we might say, no, I'm not supporting violence. No, it's about whether that is normalized and acceptable to the point that we can do that. And we're now in an environment where that happens. That did not happen in 2016. That's not happening in 2012. That's not happening in 2008. Certainly not the way it's happening now.
I think it gives us all the opportunity to sort of nip that stuff in the bud and say, not my house, not my family, not my friends.
Let's vote. Let's do politics.
Yep.
This is energy toward politics, and it's not that far away. It's never that far away in America.
Well, thank you, Professor Pape. Jasleen now is going to really sort of dig in as he laid out the post-election sort of the calendar, some broad things. I think we're going to get into some more detail here on the opportunities to really think about securing sites, facilities across that timeline for ourselves. And yeah, Jasleen, I'd like you to put a bow on this.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you, Professor Pape, for that presentation. I am hoping that I can use the time I have today to dig into laws and protections that we have against voter intimidation and intimidation of election workers. And so I'm with the Brennan Center, as Noah mentioned at the top of the call. The Brennan Center is a multifaceted advocacy organization. It's part think tank, part communications hub, part law firm. And recently we published an explainer series on the topic of legal safeguards against intimidation that provides a federal overview of safeguards against intimidation of voters and election workers. There are also state-specific explainers on this topic for 12 states where the risk of disruption is especially high based on our research on the volume of false allegations and anti-voter activity over the past few years. So those are sort of at the bottom on this page, and I believe this resource is going to be shared out by the elections group, but those states include Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Virginia. So I just have this up to let you know what this looks like, and then I'm going to stop sharing just because I don't have as great a PowerPoint as Professor Pape did. So I think the main takeaway that I have for you all today is voter intimidation is illegal. It's illegal in all 50 states. It's illegal under federal law. And federal law prohibits anyone, whether a neighbor, a state official, a poll watcher, or even law enforcement, from intimidating or threatening any citizen for voting or attempting to do so. And whether the person intended their actions to intimidate is irrelevant if they have the effect of intimidating voters. These protections also extend to anyone urging or aiding others to vote, which would include people doing get out the vote work, people assisting family members, or election workers. And these protections apply throughout the life cycle of the election. So that includes registering to vote, assisting voters, casting a ballot, counting ballots, and certifying results. So to dive a little bit deeper, I wanted to go over what those actual laws and protections are. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1957 both prohibit actual or attempted intimidation, threats, or coercion of voters. The Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 prohibits conspiracies that use force, intimidation, or threat to prevent voters from giving support or advocacy in federal elections. And the National Voter Registration Act prohibits the intimidation of people for registering or attempting to register to vote. And again, while these laws have typically been used to protect voters, some also provide protection to election officials, election workers, and others urging or aiding another person to vote or register. States also have protections of their own. So every state limits campaigning and political violence, called electioneering, within a buffer zone around polling places to mitigate the risk of intimidation and harassment. Most states strictly limit what poll watchers can do. For example, Florida, Georgia, and Nevada prohibit poll watchers from speaking to voters. Most states also limit who can serve as a poll watcher and how many watchers may be present at any one polling location at any given time. Many states also authorize election workers to remove poll watchers who are abusing the rules or intimidating voters. Additionally, states require poll workers to uphold the law. Many states require poll workers to take an oath to perform their duties. State prohibitions on intimidation apply to police and other peace officers as well, who can have an intimidating effect on voters. And state laws limit the presence of guns at the polls. So 15 states and Washington, D.C. broadly prohibit both open and concealed carry in polling places. And many other states prohibit certain forms of carrying at the polls or at other locations used as polling locations, such as churches or schools. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of the big picture thing is that there are many legal safeguards in place to protect against intimidation in our elections. And that's probably part of the reason why we rarely see voter intimidation actually occur. So if you're one of the few voters that faces intimidation or witnesses it happening to someone else, you're able to report it to local election officials. You can call an election protection hotline. It's 1-866-OUR-VOTE. And it shouldn't deter folks from participating in our elections this year. And I want to drive that point home. Intimidation is very rare, and most voters have nothing to worry about and shouldn't let the prospect of intimidation deter them from the polls this year. All that being said, voter intimidation can take many forms, but I'm just going to talk about a few examples, including improperly following, monitoring, or surveilling voters at polling locations, improper threats of potential criminal prosecution or arrest or other legal action, threats to disseminate voters' personal information, particularly when dissemination is intended to trigger harassment, and baseless voter challenges, particularly those that target voters and communities of color. And voter intimidation at the polls can include, as I mentioned, surveillance of voters or volunteers, demonstrations that prevent voters from actually accessing a polling site or even drop boxes, voters being followed to their cars or polling sites or drop boxes, menacing chants that explicitly or implicitly threaten voters or volunteers, armed individuals loitering around drop boxes or polling sites, and it can also include intimidation from poll watchers. So for example, poll watchers posing intrusive questions, physically threatening voters, or otherwise confronting or following or interfering with voters trying to cast their ballots, that counts as voter intimidation and is prohibited. And voter intimidation could stem from poll workers themselves, the people running the elections. This can include poll workers singling out voters or asking aggressive, intrusive, or unnecessary questions, poll workers threatening, confronting, following, or interfering with voters without cause. And again, to be clear, the vast majority of voters will have a seamless experience at the polls, free from voter intimidation. It just doesn't happen very often. So what I just covered were examples of what voter intimidation can look like at the polls, but prohibition against voter intimidation applies outside the polls as well. So examples of that includes canvassing, targeted telephonic targeting, and mass voter challenges. So talking about canvassing first, canvassing is a First Amendment protected activity. It's a core form of political speech that candidates and campaigns use all the time. But in the last few years, there have been reports in many states across the country of a different type of canvassing. So people going door to door to conduct citizen investigations of the accuracy of voter rolls. So if someone's coming to your house to question your eligibility to vote, that behavior can be intimidating. This is especially true if canvassing is accompanied by aggressive behavior, misinformation intended to deter election participation, the presence of firearms, targeting that's based on race or language capability, or misrepresentation of having an official election role. So canvassers who are saying they are someone who they aren't, or representing a government official when they aren't. Voters should remember that they do not have to answer questions about their eligibility when someone comes knocking at their door. Examples of telephonic targeting are robocalls threatening retaliation for voting, robocalls targeting communities of color, misinformation coming from ostensibly official sources. As some of us may recall, this happened in 2020 when robocalls targeting Black voters, targeted Black voters, threatening that if they voted by mail, their personal information would be sent to law enforcement agencies or debt collectors and the government. And one of the best things voters can do to ensure they don't fall prey to illegal schemes like this is to know the rules, make a plan to vote, and just have a plan in place so they're not misled by false or deceptive practices. And then the final sort of out of polling location activity that I talked about where intimidation could occur is mass voter challenges. Those can have an intimidating effect on voters. Most states allow private citizens to challenge fellow citizens' ballots or voter registrations. In theory, private challenge laws enable citizens to inform local officials when they know someone in their community has moved or passed away or registered to vote incorrectly. But even this theoretical benefit is minimal, both because populations have become more mobile and because election officials now have really reliable tools for updating voter rolls and are required by state and federal laws to use those tools. And in recent years, various groups have organized out of an unfounded belief that ineligible voters are swaying election results and encouraging the filing of mass challenges. In Georgia, I think almost 500,000 challenges have been filed since the 2020 election in total across the United States. And the reality is that no private citizen has useful information about the eligibility of tens of thousands of voters that isn't already available to election officials. So as I've noted, federal prohibitions on voter intimidation, they're written really broadly to cover any conduct that intimidates voters. And so just like when if a voter experiences intimidation at the polls, a voter is protected by those same intimidation laws outside the polls. And in addition to, so that sort of is just an overview of the laws and guardrails that are in our explainer series. And each state-specific explainer has state-specific laws and citations to help folks navigate what is applicable in their state. But the federal laws apply regardless, and those protections apply regardless of what state you're in. And in addition to that comprehensive explainer on all things voter intimidation, Brennan Center and the Center for Civic Design has also put together a resource on customizable signs relating to gun safety and voter intimidation. And I quickly just want to put that up on the screen to show you what that looks like. So this is a resource for folks that's related to gun safety and voter intimidation. The resource was created in response to requests from states with expansive open and concealed carry, but states where they have expansive and open concealed carry, but they have new gun bans on polling locations or drop boxes or counting facilities. And since gun owners may not be aware that there are new prohibitions, we wanted to respond to that. And this is also responsive to states that requested some sort of toolkit where the state has no bans, but they're looking for ways to deter the presence of guns at polling locations. So this is a sampling of what that looks like. There's 4 different slides. They're all customizable. And these are just one of the many tools that election officials will have at their disposal as they decide on how best to make the election safe for voters and election workers in their jurisdiction and depending on the circumstances and potential threats in their specific community. And that is all I have for you.
This is really fantastic. We kind of started at a kind of high level about where is America at right now, right? How enraged are we? How disenfranchised do we feel that we would turn to violence or be ambivalent about it? And we can all sort of see ourselves and our team in that. So that's important context as we look afterwards. I appreciate, Jasleen, your presentation, like voter kind of facing, recognizing that like the risk proposition, at the retail level is different across 11,000 election jurisdictions in this country, and realizing that there are protections in place, that election officials sort of relying on some of those to support their voters can be helpful in the run-up. You also get the sense that everybody's crossing their fingers for their team to win come November 5th, and that like most people's big picture worries are afterwards. Professor Pape really dug into some of those. Putting on my CSSE hat real quick, just safeelections.org. It's a recognition that there's still time for election officials to meet with their law enforcement to build some planning, particularly around the post-election period. The incentive to stop additional accounting if your team has the ball is going to be higher than it would otherwise, especially right now. We're all just crossing our fingers and hoping our team wins, I assume. This is a sort of powerful statement of sort of where we are. I know there aren't all election officials on this call, but this isn't just about elections. We're seeing this angst in schools and in hospitals, and it's sort of touching us all. There's a tremendous inflection point coming November 5th and in the days that follow. But it reminds me that this is a kind of perennial problem that we're going to be wrestling with for a generation. Can I turn it over to either of you for like closing comments, to the extent that some of you had questions for Professor Pape on methodology, et cetera, I'd say direct those like to him separately if possible. But Jeslie, do you have anything that you want to sort of wrap up and drive home as your final point here?
I mean, I think the final point is something I mentioned in my presentation, but I know we're living in an environment where there's a huge increase and anxiety about, what's going to happen this November, what's going to happen when I go to vote. But I think the reality is the vast majority of us are going to have a safe, a secure, smooth, non-eventful voting experience. So I want to emphasize that.
I'll plus one that. How about you, Professor Pape?
So I just want to say, I think we've had an excellent presentation of the landscape. To be sure, there are dangers on voting day itself. And I'm emphasizing the dangers afterwards because I think they'll be more concentrated in nature, but both really do matter. The other thing I want to just advocate for again is to do support to do that other national survey in November. And then the final thing I want to say is that if there are let's call them events that happened either before or during or after the election, I am absolutely glad Noah and the Brennan Center to try to put together something like a rapid Zoom discussion, because that may turn out to be extremely valuable if we do find ourselves in even more of a tense moment than we are now. I want to leave us with although there's dark clouds, there really is optimism here, because you're hearing from Jasleen that everybody personally is likely to be absolutely fine here. The vast majority for sure. But what's really the reason to be optimistic is because we are going to pull on this rope together. We are going to come through this transition time together. And so although we have some dark clouds, I think the silver lining is who we are as a people. And that is first and foremost reflected in this election group and the election officials and the election workers. This really is the leading edge of the best of our democracy and the best of America. And I think it really bodes great confidence for what's going to happen, and we will navigate these waters.
Well, I appreciate you both. Thank you all on the call for your time. I know at this point in the calendar, 42 days or 44 days, like you're sacrificing a lot. Appreciate your willingness. Hopefully you found something valuable so that you can operationalize some planning changes. And we look forward to seeing you again on a webinar soon. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Noah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jasleen.